Nobody expected the human to survive the first round. Half the arena was already laughing before he even stepped onto the sand. He walked in with no armor, no blade, no weapon of any kind, just a pair of worn gloves and a look on his face that most of the crowd mistook for stupidity. They had no idea it was something else entirely. The Grand Coalition tournament had run for over 400 years, a brutal contest held once every generation, where the greatest warriors from across a dozen alien empires gathered to prove whose species reigned supreme. Champions trained their entire lives for a single chance to compete. Kingdoms rose and fell on the reputations built inside that arena. And this year, for the first time in the tournament's history, a human had been entered. Nobody had asked for his opinion on the matter, least of all him. His name was Marcus Reyes, and 3 weeks earlier, he'd been working cargo-loading shifts on a Verity trade station, just trying to save enough credits to get back to what was left of Earth's outer colonies. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter by trade. He was just a man who had spent his whole life on a planet that had tried to kill him since the day he was born. Humanity's homeworld had been classified centuries ago by every major alien government as a death world, a planet so hostile, so unstable, so relentlessly dangerous, that any species capable of surviving there long-term was considered either remarkably resilient or completely insane. Most aliens believed it was the second one. They had absolutely no idea how wrong they were. Marcus had been dragged into the tournament through a debt his cousin owed to a Verity crime syndicate that used the tournament's lower brackets as a way to launder credits and settle old scores. Enter a disposable fighter, let them get slaughtered in the first round, collect the insurance payout from rival betting houses. Nobody running that scheme expected the disposable fighter to still be breathing after round 1. That mistake would cost them everything. The arena itself was a massive coliseum carved into the side of a mountain on the Verity homeworld, capable of holding over 200,000 spectators from a dozen different species. Banners from every major empire hung from its towering walls, generations of champions immortalized in gold and stone. And in the center of it all, seated in the royal box reserved for the ruling houses, sat Princess Lorana Vex, heir to the Verity throne, and reigning judge of the tournament's honor code. She had seen thousands of fighters pass through that arena. She expected nothing from the human entry except a quick, embarrassing elimination. She had absolutely no idea how wrong she was about to be. "A human," she said flatly, watching him walk onto the sand from her private box, her tone somewhere between disbelief and mild irritation. "Barehanded. No armor. No weapon requisition filed. Who allowed this?" Her advisor, an older Verity general named Threk, shifted uncomfortably beside her. "The entry was filed through a syndicate loophole, Your Highness. Technically legal, ethically questionable." "He's going to die in the first 30 seconds, Lorana muttered. The crowd seemed to agree, laughter rippling through the lower stands as Marcus's opponent stepped onto the sand. A towering Grothery warrior nearly 8 feet tall, covered in ceremonial battle plating, wielding a serrated energy blade that hummed with barely contained power. "Is this some kind of joke?" The Grothery warrior boomed, his voice amplified across the arena. "They send me a hairless pink creature with no weapon." Marcus didn't answer. He just rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, and settled into a low, steady stance. Something about the way he moved made the laughter in the crowd falter, just slightly. The horn sounded and the match began. The Grothery warrior charged immediately, his blade carving a brutal arc through the air, more than enough force behind it to cleave a lesser fighter clean in half. Marcus didn't run. He didn't dodge dramatically. He simply stepped, just barely, just enough, letting the blade whistle past close enough to feel the heat of it against his skin. Then he drove his elbow into the warrior's exposed throat, plating with everything he had. The Grothery staggered, more from shock than pain, absolutely certain this shouldn't have been possible. The crowd's laughter died completely. What followed wasn't elegant. It wasn't the practiced, ceremonial combat style the tournament usually showcased. It was raw, brutal, efficient violence, the kind born from a lifetime of having to fight simply to keep breathing. Marcus ducked under a second wild swing, grabbed the warrior's arm, and used his opponent's own momentum to slam him face first into the sand. The impact shook dust into the air. Lorana leaned forward in her seat, her earlier irritation replaced by something far more complicated. The Grothri warrior rose, furious now, swinging his blade in a series of increasingly desperate strikes. But Marcus kept moving, kept slipping through gaps that shouldn't have existed, kept finding openings that no untrained fighter should have been able to see. "He's reading his movements," Threk said slowly, watching with growing unease. "He's not just surviving, he's calculating." Finally, after nearly 6 full minutes, an eternity by tournament standards, Marcus caught the warrior's blade arm, twisted with brutal precision, and drove him into the ground hard enough to end the match completely. The horn sounded. Silence swept across the arena, 200,000 spectators struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the silence broke into something else entirely. A wave of stunned, disbelieving murmurs rippling from the lower stands all the way up to the royal box itself. "That," Lorana said quietly, almost to herself, "should not have been possible." Word of the humans' victory spread through the tournament grounds like wildfire. By the time Marcus returned to the fighters' holding chambers, exhausted, bruised, breathing hard, he found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from every delegation in the Colosseum. Rival champions studied recordings of the fight late into the night, searching for weaknesses, searching for explanations. Betting houses scrambled to adjust odds that had been considered a lock just hours earlier. And the crime syndicate that had entered him as a disposable pawn suddenly realized their plan had backfired in the worst possible way. But nobody was more unsettled by what they'd seen than Princess Lorana herself. She requested an audience with him that evening, officially to discuss tournament logistics. Unofficially, she needed to understand what she had just witnessed. "You have no formal combat training," she said, studying him carefully as he stood before her in the private meeting chamber, still nursing a split knuckle from the fight. "No military record. No syndicate affiliation beyond the debt that forced you here. And yet you just defeated a Grothri war champion with your bare hands. Your homeworld doesn't hand out weapons for free," Marcus said simply. "Where I'm from, you learn to fight, or you don't survive long enough to matter." Lorana's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain." So he did. He told her about Earth, the real Earth, not the sanitized version most alien historical records described. About storms that could level cities in hours. About wildlife that had evolved specifically to kill anything that moved. About generations of humans who had no choice but to become stronger, faster, and more resourceful, simply because the alternative was extinction. "Every human alive today is descended from someone who survived something that should have killed them," Marcus said. "We don't train for combat because we want glory. We train because our entire species has spent its whole existence one bad decision away from dying." Lorana sat back slowly, processing something that clearly unsettled the foundation of everything she thought she understood about his species. "The reports my empire receives about your homeworld," she said quietly, "they describe humans as fragile, short-lived, barely capable of surviving your own planet's baseline conditions. That's exactly what we want you to keep believing," Marcus said, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his face for the first time. Something about that answer sent a chill through her that she couldn't quite explain, and an intrigue she didn't expect to feel. Over the following days, as the tournament progressed through its brutal elimination rounds, Marcus kept winning. Each victory grew more impossible than the last. A Kryvex duelist who had never lost a single match in 11 years fell to him in under 4 minutes. A pair of Scytheri twins, fighters who had trained together since birth and were considered nearly unbeatable as a team, found themselves outmaneuvered and defeated by a man who had learned to fight from nothing but necessity and desperation. The crowd that once laughed now watched in reverent silence every time he stepped onto the sand. And Laranna found herself watching closer than anyone. She began attending his training sessions, ostensibly for tournament oversight purposes, though her advisors quietly noted she spent far more time there than any judging responsibility required. "You fight like someone who expects to lose everything if you don't win," she observed one evening, watching him work through drills alone in the empty training yard. Exhaustion etched into every movement, but his intensity never faltering. "I do," Marcus admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Where I come from, losing isn't just embarrassing. It's fatal. You learn to treat every fight like it's the last one you'll ever get." "That's an exhausting way to live," she said softly. "It's the only way I know how," he replied. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, something unspoken passing between them that neither was quite ready to acknowledge yet. But their growing connection hadn't gone unnoticed, and not everyone in the Verity court viewed it favorably. Lord Kryn Vashta, head of one of the Empire's most powerful noble houses, had watched the humans rise through the tournament with mounting fury. His own son, a heavily favored champion expected to win the entire tournament, had already been eliminated in the semi-final bracket, humiliated by a species most Verity considered barely worth acknowledging. Worse still, his intelligence network had confirmed the rumors spreading through the palace. The crown princess herself was showing open interest in the human fighter. "This cannot continue," Vashta hissed during an emergency council session, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "A human, barehanded, undermining generations of tournament tradition, and now potentially influencing the crown princess herself. This is an embarrassment to the entire empire." "The human has won every match through legitimate combat," Threk pointed out carefully. "There's no rule violation to exploit." "Then we create one," Vashta snapped. That night, arrangements were made that would turn the tournament's final rounds into something far deadlier than anyone had anticipated. And Marcus had no idea just how much danger he was about to walk into. The semi-final match was supposed to be straightforward, Marcus against a heavily favored Dravith champion known for overwhelming brute strength. But when Marcus stepped onto the sand, something felt wrong immediately. The arena's usual security presence seemed thinner than normal. The referee assigned to oversee the match was someone he didn't recognize from previous rounds. And his opponent's weapon, when inspected under the tournament's standard safety protocols, had somehow passed certification despite modifications that shouldn't have been legal. Laranna noticed it too, watching from her private box with growing unease. "Something's wrong," she said quietly to Threk. "That blade shouldn't have cleared inspection." "I'll investigate immediately," Threk replied, already moving. But it was too late. The horn sounded, and the Dravith champion charged with a speed and ferocity that went far beyond anything sanctioned by tournament rules, his modified weapon crackling with unauthorized energy output that could do far more than simply defeat an opponent. Could kill him. Marcus barely avoided the first strike, the modified blade scorching the sand where he'd been standing a heartbeat earlier. He rolled, came up fighting, but the sheer power behind each swing was forcing him into a defensive position he'd never had to use before. This wasn't a fair fight anymore. This was an assassination dressed up as a tournament match. Laranna shot to her feet in the royal box, fury replacing shock instantly. "Stop the match. Stop it now." But tournament protocol required official confirmation before any match could be halted mid-combat. And by the time officials began scrambling to respond, Marcus had already taken a glancing hit that tore through his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt instantly. The crowd gasped collectively, the brutal reality of what was happening finally sinking in. Marcus staggered, pain radiating through his entire arm. But something in his expression shifted in that moment, exhaustion burning away into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. He had faced worse than this. His entire life had been worse than this. The Dravith champion pressed his advantage, swinging again with lethal intent, fully expecting the wounded human to finally go down. Instead, Marcus caught the blade's shaft with his good arm, ignoring the searing heat against his palm, and drove his knee upward with every ounce of desperate strength he had left. The champion doubled over, and Marcus wrenched the modified weapon free, turning what had been used as a murder weapon against him into the very thing that ended the fight. He didn't kill him. Even wounded, even furious, even fighting for his life against a rigged assassination attempt, Marcus stopped himself at the last second, driving the hilt into the champion's temple instead, ending the match without ending a life. The horn sounded. The match was over. But the silence that followed wasn't celebration. It was horror, as officials rushed the field and the truth of what had just happened became impossible to ignore. Someone had tried to have him killed in front of 200,000 witnesses. Lorana was at his side within minutes, medical officers working frantically to stabilize his shoulder as she knelt beside him on the sand, something raw and furious burning in her eyes. "Who did this?" she demanded, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Doesn't matter," Marcus said through gritted teeth, pain evident in every word. "I'm still standing." "It matters to me," she said fiercely, and for the first time since he'd met her, the composed, guarded princess was completely gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely terrified of what she'd almost lost. The investigation moved quickly once the tournament's ruling council realized the severity of what had occurred. Weapon inspection logs, security footage, and testimony from the compromised referee all pointed toward the same conclusion. Lord Vashta had orchestrated the entire attack, using his political influence to alter inspection protocols and bribe officials in a desperate attempt to eliminate the human fighter before he could reach the tournament final. When confronted before the full council, Vashta didn't even bother denying it, his pride refusing to let him grovel even in defeat. "An outsider was humiliating 400 years of tournament tradition," he snarled. "I did what was necessary to protect the honor of this empire." "You tried to murder a competitor in front of the entire coalition," Lorana said, her voice cold as ice. "There is no honor in that. Only cowardice." Vashta was stripped of his title and holdings on the spot, his house's centuries of standing collapsing within a single afternoon. A stunning fall for a man who had believed his prejudice justified murder. But even as justice was served, the tournament faced an unprecedented question. With his opponent's disqualification, Marcus had technically advanced to the final round. But he was wounded, exhausted, and had every reason in the world to walk away. Nobody would have blamed him if he had. Instead, 3 days later, still favoring his bandaged shoulder, Marcus walked back onto the sand for the tournament final. The arena had never been more packed. Word of the assassination attempt, the scandal, and Marcus's refusal to back down despite everything had spread across every allied system connected to the coalition. What started as a curiosity had become something the entire galaxy was watching. His opponent in the final was Kaidos Renner, the tournament's reigning 3-time champion, a Verity warrior so skilled and so respected that even Lorana herself had trained under his guidance years earlier. "You don't have to do this," Lorana told Marcus quietly before the match, genuine concern evident in her voice. "Nobody would think less of you for withdrawing after everything that happened." "I would," Marcus said simply. "I didn't come this far to walk away because someone tried to scare me off." She studied him for a long moment, something fierce and proud replacing the worry in her expression. "Then don't lose." "Wasn't planning on it," he said, the faintest smile crossing his tired features. The horn sounded, and the final match began. Kaidos was everything the tournament's reputation promised: fast, precise, and devastatingly skilled. Every movement refined through decades of formal training that Marcus simply didn't have. For the first several minutes, it was clear this fight would be different from anything Marcus had faced so far. He was losing. Kaidos moved like water, finding gaps in Marcus's defense that no previous opponent had managed to exploit, each exchange leaving new bruises and shallow cuts across his already battered body. The crowd held its collective breath, watching the impossible underdog story teeter on the edge of finally coming to an end. But Marcus had spent his entire life being underestimated, being counted out, being told he shouldn't survive the world he'd been born into, and he had never once let that stop him. Drawing on reserves of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond simple physical endurance, Marcus began adapting mid-fight, studying the patterns in Kaidos's technique, finding the same kind of desperate creative solutions that had kept humanity alive across a planet that had tried to kill them since the beginning of their existence. He stopped fighting like a tournament competitor. He started fighting like a man who had survived a death world. The final exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Kaidos committed to what should have been a finishing strike, absolutely certain of victory, and Marcus did something no formally trained warrior would have risked. He let the strike connect against his already wounded shoulder, absorbing brutal pain in exchange for the perfect opening, and drove Kaidos to the ground with a move that had no elegant name, no formal technique classification, just raw, desperate, unbreakable will. The horn sounded. For a moment, the entire arena simply stared, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the silence shattered into the loudest roar the Colosseum had heard in 400 years. 200,000 voices from a dozen different species rising together in stunned, overwhelming celebration. A human, barehanded, wounded, underestimated from the very first moment he stepped onto the sand, had just become the tournament champion. Laranna didn't wait for official ceremony protocol. She crossed the arena floor herself, in full view of the entire coalition, and reached him just as he sank to his knees, exhaustion and relief finally overwhelming him completely. "You beautiful, impossible fool," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she knelt beside him. "You could have died out there. But I didn't," Marcus said, breathless, exhausted, and unmistakably alive. "No," she whispered, cupping his face gently despite the blood and dust covering him. "You didn't." And in front of 200,000 witnesses, representatives from every major power in the coalition, and a galaxy that would never again underestimate what a human was truly capable of, Princess Laranna Vex kissed the Deathworld champion who had walked into that arena with nothing but his bare hands, and walked out having changed everything. The tournament crown was placed on his head that evening, but Marcus barely noticed it. What mattered wasn't the title or the glory, or the legend that would follow his name across a dozen star systems for generations to come. What mattered was the woman standing beside him, who had seen past every assumption her empire had ever held about his species, and chosen to stand with him anyway. News of what happened in that arena spread far beyond Verityspace within days, reaching systems and empires that had never given humanity a second thought. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of distant galactic councils, old assumptions about Deathworld humans being weak, fragile, or beneath consideration began quietly, permanently unraveling. But even as celebrations continued across the capital, whispers had already begun reaching Laranna's private council, whispers of other empires taking sudden, urgent interest in the tournament's outcome, and in the man who had won it. Because if one Deathworld human could accomplish something no coalition champion in 400 years had managed, the question on everyone's mind was no longer whether humans deserved respect. It was how many more like him were out there waiting to be discovered.